Professor Clive Hamilton has been warning for some time about the Chinese regime's influence in Australia. In fact, his book, his latest book, Silent Invasion, China's Influence in Australia, it nearly didn't get published here because 3 publishers pulled out, fearing reprisals if they did so. But Clive Hamilton, I'm glad to tell you, he joins me now. Clive, it's good to catch up with you again. It seems that we have 2 options when we look at what's happening in Australia with these pro-China protests, and neither of them seems to be very good. One is that these protests here by Chinese people against democracy for Hong Kong are organised and encouraged by China, as we just heard Mr Pavlou just say. Or the second option is that we really do have hundreds and hundreds of Chinese here who are prepared to fight for this dictatorship on our streets. Which one of those 2 options seems to you the most true?
Well, I think, Andrew, both of them are true. And unfortunately, they kind of work together. I think it's true to say that all of the protests that we've seen carried out on the streets and campuses of Australia over the last 2 or so weeks in Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney, Brisbane, they would not have happened unless they had had the nod and perhaps the strong encouragement of the relevant consulates in those cities. That's how it works. The Chinese students on the campuses wait for a signal from the consulate in order to go out and engage in their protests. And I heard the interview you just had with Drew Pavlou, and it really was very chilling when he pointed out that some of the heavies, the ones that triggered the violence, I mean, they didn't look like students at all. And in fact, they did look like state security people. And there was an incident that happened a few days later on the University of Queensland campus. They had a Lenin wall there. The Hong Kong students were putting up their notices, Free Hong Kong and so on and so forth. And 3 men came along one evening and started to tear them all down. A security guard from the university came up and said, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to do that. Show me your student identification cards." And they said, "Well, no, we're not going to show you that." He said, "Show me them or I'll have to call the police." And one of them said to him, "We don't care if you call the police. We will call the ambassador." I mean, this... Seriously. I mean...
No, but also, but Clive, you know, this thing about your anecdote there, Clive, that frightens me is the sense of unreality of what we're dealing with here. We are not dealing with people representing a Western democracy with, you know, free courts and all that. We are dealing with a totalitarian regime that punishes the relatives of people who speak up. And I think it's time that some universities recognise that.
Well, not just universities, but also authorities elsewhere. I mean, what this man was saying to the security guard was, it's not the police or the Vice-Chancellor who gives us the right to be here. It's the Chinese ambassador. And, you know, whether that's true or not, here were these men operating on the campus who believed that. And you have to ask yourself, what is it that they gave those men and indeed the students who engaged in that very rowdy and at times violent protest where Drew was punched and pushed around, what gave them the sense of entitlement that they own the campus of the University of Queensland? And I think they've been sent a message over the years by the university authorities and the Vice-Chancellor that we love China, anything China does here is fair game. We will even make the Consul General a professor of our
Can you believe that? Can you believe that?
I could not believe that. It happened a few days before the violence on the campus. Interestingly, the university did not make a public announcement about that. It was only when observers picked it up in the Chinese language press that they saw that this had happened. But even on our streets, where we've seen a series of violent incidents of ultra-patriotic Chinese students and other people engage in some very heavy acts. There have been a whole bunch of them on YouTube and online showing Taiwanese and pro-Hong Kong protesters being attacked and beaten, and suddenly out of nowhere these heavies come along and really you know, engage in intimidation. So yeah, having watched these, I am quite chilled by what's going on. I'm asking myself, well, who controls the streets of our capital cities? What are our
I
authorities
think
doing about it?
you ask a really good question, and I think when it comes to universities, what is our export industry in Chinese students worth now? Something like $30 billion, including all foreign students, I think, but mostly Chinese. I mean, that's money the university is so desperate for. They'll sell out almost anything, it seems. Now, you ask, you know, you question the identity of some of the pro-China protesters, whether they're really students. I've got some footage coming up of speakers at the Sydney pro-China rally over the weekend. There seemed to be, among those ringleaders around the microphone, there seemed to be both students and some older people, one on the far left of that shot and an older woman as well. The students look actually quite well dressed. They seem like little princes rather than members of the Chinese proletariat who are lucky enough to be subsidised to come here, Clive.
Well, there was a kind of Uber incident like that in the streets of Sydney a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years, 3 years ago, I think, where a group of young Chinese Australians decided to hold a protest in favour of China's occupation of the South China Sea. And so they got together driving their Lamborghinis and Ferraris. And there were about 30 of them in these, you know, supercars. And they spray painted them with, "We will not give up 1 inch of territory," and opponents of China must be killed, and this kind of thing. And they drove slowly around Sydney, including and stopped outside the main building at the University of Sydney and held this bizarre protest. So we have to recognise that those people we just saw up there speaking and saying those patriotic slogans, their credibility in Beijing just went up a great deal.
Absolutely.
They will go back national heroes. And that's what they're playing to that audience and being encouraged by the authorities in China.
But why we're encouraging them, I do not know. Finally, Clive, the battle for Hong Kong's freedom, how important is this? For me, it seems like an almost epoch-defining moment. If China does crush Hong Kong, what should that tell us?
Well, look, the people of Hong Kong, the millions of them who've turned out on the streets, understand that this really is an existential moment for their freedoms, for their democratic rights. If they lose this and Beijing succeeds in its continued push to erode the institutions of democracy and free speech in China, and let's remember they've been taking over the newspapers, they've been taking over the universities, they've been taking over the political system, of course, and they're even trying to erode the judiciary. Hong Kong people can see where that's going, and it's either fight back or leave, or live under the Beijing's totalitarianism, because within a decade, that's where they will be.
I'm afraid you're probably right. Clive Hamilton, thank you so much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.